Yep, this is Kristen. Thanks so much, everyone. Really excited to be able to join you all. I'm an engagement project manager here at 270 Strategies, and I've been with our firm for about the past 3 years, but mostly my experience comes in the advocacy world. So having done a lot of community organizing, but also worked at the federal advocacy level here in the US around a variety of issues around transportation and affordable housing and things like that. And like Natalie, I've done a few political cycles as well, 2008 and 2012, and have seen what Snowflake engagement and real kind of organizing models can mean for the work that we're able to do and how we're able to bring it to scale. So we're excited to talk with you all today.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen. So now that you know a bit about us, we'd love to get to know you all better. So if you can, we have the chat box at the bottom of your screen. If you can type your name and your organization and a fun fact about yourself, we'd really love to see who's on. I see that we have Brittany's on. Welcome, Brittany. And for those who are new to this technology, if you look at the bottom of your control panel, you'll see a screen that says chat or a button that says chat, and you can press that and just go ahead and type in the chat box. We have Lori Walton and Bob Eaton. Welcome you all. Thanks for joining. Gloria and Greg. Tina, and she is a dancing grandmother. Awesome fun fact. Thank you. And we have Tracy. Excellent, wants to put food on the budget. Felix, Victoria. Looks like we have a lot of really great folks on. And Victoria has been living all over the world, it looks like. So this is really just an opportunity for us to get to know who's on the call. And unfortunately, we're not able to put names to faces. But I hope that you all will look in the chat box too and see who else is on. Hopefully see familiar names. But ultimately to know that we're in this together. There are other awesome, really wonderful people who are on trying to learn about grassroots engagement. So we'll have continuous conversation throughout this webinar. So let's get into the goals of today's conversation. So the goals, the first thing, we want you, the participants, to have an understanding of the Snowflake model of organizing. We're going to talk a lot about why we use it and what makes it effective. The second thing we want from this conversation is to basically share an understanding of the ladder of engagement and how we use that to move people to take increasingly meaningful actions over time. And then the third goal of today's conversation is really just a discussion. We're going to have a discussion on how organizing best practices might help address challenges in your work. So those are the goals for today's call, and we'll go through the agenda very quickly. We've already done our introduction, agenda, and goals, but we're going to take 15 minutes to talk about the Snowflake model. From there, we're going to talk about ladders of engagement. We're going to get into case studies to give you examples of both the Snowflake model and ladder of engagement and how that's worked with other engagements. And then we're going to talk and workshop this. So actually an opportunity for you to apply this to your work and think how these structures can work for your organization, whether you're doing advocacy work or electoral work. And then lastly, we're going to debrief. So that's our agenda for today's call. And of course, we have some norms that help this conversation be really effective and engaging. So first, the most important thing is for you to participate. We love to hear from you, and we love to answer your questions and see your comments and see your responses. So you've already had experience using the control panel, but the best way to participate is to type your questions and type your comments in the chat box. While I'm talking and presenting, Kristen is on board, and Kristen will be answering any questions that you have that may come up during the webinar, during the presentation. So you're going to type those questions in the chat box, and then later we're going to workshop these activities, and you'll see under your materials tab a worksheet that you will download and use later in our conversation. So those are our norms, excuse me. So let's get into the actual workshop. So the first thing we're going to talk about today are snowflakes, and we're going to talk about the Snowflake model. And Snowflake models are really a way that we structure and organize into teams. So we have this quote here: organizing teams are groups of interdependent members, typically volunteers, who have a shared responsibility to achieve clearly defined goals, right? So we organize into teams when we know that we can accomplish a lot more together than we can on our own. And, organizing in teams has been something people have done for ages. And it's something that we see in our everyday lives. For me, the first time I remember organizing in teams was working as and volunteering as a Girl Scout in my community. I worked with other girls to sell cookies, to clean up our neighborhoods, and working together, we were able to accomplish more together than we could on our own. What are some teams that you all have worked on in the past or been a part of? It can be sports teams, debate teams. Would love to hear from you all, and you can do that by typing in the chat box. So we have Laura, who was a political candidate in the 2011 elections. I'm sure she worked with a team of folks around that election. Someone was involved with parent councils fighting education cuts, air cadets, awesome, so and LGBTQ groups. So there are a lot of different teams, and we all have worked in teams, whether they're church groups, social groups, democracy teams, to make change in our communities and to work together. So let's get more into the Snowflake model. Let's get into the weeds of this. And the Snowflake model really is a model where we work into teams, but it's one that we found has worked really well in the advocacy space and doing political work and electoral work. So we're going to talk a little bit about how this model works as compared to other traditional models. So as you can see on the slide, there are two other traditional models of organizing. We can see on the left, we have a model that is really focused on the leader. And the second model to the right, we see really focused on the participants or the volunteers. So I'd love for you all to take a look at these two models. We'll first focus on the model on the left, the model where everything's centered in on the leader. And I'd love to hear from you all. What is wrong with this model, or what stands out to you about this model? And while people are looking and thinking on this, I'll go ahead and explain a little bit. So this one is really a challenge around management ratio, right? You see so many people, one person wrote bottlenecked, no interaction between participants. That's exactly right. You see everybody going in to talk to and share their problems or ask questions of this one leader. But what happens if the leader disappears? What happens if the leader is not there? No one knows what to do. The operation falls apart, right? Let's see what some other folks say. Yep, someone says when the leader leaves, you lose the relationships. That's exactly right. Goals and success of participants are shadowed by the leader and their end goal and results. Right, there's no collaboration. Everything is centered around the leader. Perfect, thank you all for your participation. Now let's go to the model on the right. I'd love to hear thoughts on the model on the right. What stands out to you when you see that model? And with this, as you look at it, you can see everyone's going their own direction. There isn't really any strong communication. Someone said no one really works together, and it can be disorganized. Right, there's no one there providing direction. Also with that, there's no central decision maker, right? So no one really knows what to do. Someone wrote they lose the common message. There's no focus, too many hands in too many pots. Exactly. You don't know what the other hand is doing, and it's hard to work together on an issue. Definitely, those are all really wonderful comments and all very true. there really isn't a path for clear communication. Nobody really knows what the other person is doing. So that's why we tend to go with and work with the Snowflake model. So let's go to the Snowflake model. And we call it the Snowflake model because, as you can see, it kind of looks like a snowflake a little bit. So I'd love to hear from you all. What stands out about this model? As you can see, it's very different from the other ones. And just a little map. In the center of the model is the leader. And following the leader are like volunteer leaders or sub leaders. So what are some things that stand out to you about this one? I love this, Brittany. Everyone works together towards a common goal. That's absolutely right. Interaction, Mike wrote, everyone makes decisions and the group has strength. Definitely, you can see the lines of communication. If you look at the arrows, they go back and forth. Someone wrote, creates a web of relationships much more resilient. Definitely. You see the levels of relationships, you see the connections. And Janet is absolutely right, it's more collaborative. You see everyone is working together in this model. So we really like this model because one, you have sustainable management ratios. And like the first model where you saw everybody going into talking to the manager, to the leader, in this model, you see no one person is managing too many people or too many projects. It's really streamlined here. We also have clear pathways of communication. The structure is clear and people know who to talk to and about what and when. You have clearly defined roles and expectations, and we're going to get into this in the next few slides talking about what these roles are. But there's really no confusion on who is owning which piece or what someone's tasks are. And then you have mutual accountability. No one's in this on their own. Everyone's holding each other accountable. And you can see that they're connected. You have not only accountability for the manager, but you have it for the managee and vice versa. And then what I love about this model too is just the shared responsibility. And you see that there are people who are really empowered to own their own pieces of the work, rather than the ownership being concentrated around one person. So I'm looking at some of the comments that are coming through. And I see Mike says it also takes the weight off of doing everyone off of one person. Exactly. So everything's not dependent on one person. So that's the Snowflake model and a little bit about why we use it and how we use it. Thank you all so much for participating. So with the Snowflake model, let's talk a little bit about the roles within the Snowflake model. We used this in the Obama campaign, and we called this the neighborhood team model, right? And at the very center of it, you have your team leader. And the team leader is really the person who's recruiting, who's training, and coordinating others. They build the team and they can help set the goals. And then surrounded by the team leader, you have the core team members. And in the Obama campaign, core team members had specific and specialized roles, and they take ownership over a specific function. So in the example of the Obama campaign, we had volunteer coordinators, right? We had voter registration coordinators. So those were our core team members. We had a phone bank captain and we had a canvas captain because those were the main things that we were focusing on doing during those campaigns. So those captains, those core team members, all manage volunteers who are kind of on the outer circle, and you don't really see it in this model, but you'll see it in the slides to come. But really there's a role and there's a place for everyone. And I'm looking at sorry, seems to be a problem with the sound. Is anyone having trouble with the sound? Just checking, we might have technical difficulties. Mike hears me. Excellent. Great, sorry about that, folks. I'm just gonna keep going then. If I come out, please let me know. So what's really great about this model, it really allows you to scale and it allows you to grow over time. That's one of the reasons we use it, and that's one of the things that we saw happen throughout the Obama campaign. So here we have one leader, one team leader, right? That, and I'm sorry with the slides. And that leader found core team members. Core team members found people to join their team, right? And then as these groups started to get bigger and bigger, they branched off and grew even more. So this is one of the reasons why we use the Snowflake model. Um, it helps to maximize your efforts. You can make more calls. You can knock on more doors. That's what we found. We started with a small team, and that team went and recruited other people to become involved. And the Snowflake just got bigger and bigger. We had over 2,000 organizers, and those organizers, through using this model, were able to recruit over 2 million volunteers. Um, and it works differently for how you're using the model, but there is a lot of opportunity to grow and to scale. So we saw this growth exponentially over time throughout the campaign. So starting in June, and this is from 2012, we had only a few volunteers or a few voters contacted. So we used phone banking, we used canvassing as our methods of contacting voters, right? And then as we started using this model, and as volunteers recruited other volunteers, and as volunteers took on leadership roles, we saw by the time that we got to November, as we were getting close to the election, we saw our activity grow exponentially. We were able to reach even more voters. So we've found this method to be really effective, and some of the reasons we found it to be effective, this will basically be a repeat of some of the things that I've already said, but you have sustainable management ratios. We loved that this method was hyper-localized engagement, and it reflected local communities. So when we used this model in 2012, people were organizing in their communities. So an organizer would be located in the community and find volunteers in that community. So that's how we were able to scale and to grow. And people felt more empowered because they were talking to their neighbors, they were engaging their community. Um, we also love that this has clearly defined roles and expectations. You have a multiplying effect, which I just talked about. And then there's a long-term commitment rooted in strong relationships. We know that organizing really is all about relationships and developing relationships. And this model, the Snowflake model, really helps to create and sustain those relationships. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this too, but investment in training, coaching, and development. We'll talk about this when we get into ladders of engagement. But you don't have a volunteer just become a volunteer leader. You prepare them, you train them, and you develop them. And that keeps people engaged, it keeps people motivated, and really helps your effort to grow. So one thing that's important to know is that teams don't just happen, an organizer develops them over time. So your volunteer team or the team that's in your model, your Snowflake model, takes time to grow. And this is an example of a ladder, but you will start off as a prospective team. You'll have people that you think may be good fits for your team who could take on certain roles. Then your team forms into a team. So you have the forming team stage where you start putting folks into those roles and testing to make sure they're good fits. Then you have a formed team where your team is actually coming together. You may be working through challenges, learning how to operate as a team, learning the different people and different styles of leadership within your team. And then you have your experienced team when you all have gotten used to one another, you're starting to flow, and your work is coming together, and you're making progress towards your goal. And then you have your evolving team, and at that point your team is so strong you're even able to branch out and bring more people in. And we look at this in 4 phases. So we consider it the forming phase, so your team is forming, coming together. The storming phase, we know that there may be some storms, it may be difficult, it might be challenging at times. Warming, things start to get a little bit normal. You all are starting to flow, come together, work together well. And then performing, your team is performing, you're starting to accomplish your goals. So this is important to know that, forming teams and adopting the Snowflake model, those things don't just happen overnight. It takes time and it takes work, and it's not always easy. But this is something that we know has been going on for a long time, right? This model, the Snowflake model, and really organizing in teams has been a part of the grassroots movement for a really long time. It's been a part of history. You can see we have Dr. King here. In the civil rights movement, they organized in teams. You had groups like SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, that had students organize and come together, work in teams to participate in the freedom rides and desegregate public transportation, participate in sit-ins. You have Cesar Chavez with farm workers, and Obama, who our model is based off of, and whose campaign model, as we just talked about, incorporated working in teams to help get out the vote and speak to voters. So this is a model that we know works. We've seen it work, and with snowflake models, it's important to know, like you hear the statement about snowflakes all the time, no snowflake looks alike, right? So your snowflake may have different roles than the roles we talked about a few minutes ago, and the size may be different. As we talked about, it takes time to grow. Your snowflake may be smaller. But this is just one tool that you can use to organize your teams. Another tool is the ladder of engagement. And as we talked about, organizing is all about relationships, and ladders of engagement really are ways for you to move your relationship. So there are some guiding principles for ladders of engagement. The first one is that past behavior is the best predictor of future behavior. So when we use this principle, when thinking about our ladders of engagement, we know that someone who's involved or who has taken one action or step is likely to take another, or is a person who can be engaged at a higher level. The second point is that leadership is developed. Like any other skill, it takes practice and it takes work. And you can't expect someone to just come in and be a leader for you. You have to prepare them to be a leader. In the same way you learn an instrument or learn a language, it takes time and training, and leadership is the same way. And we'll see that in our ladder of engagement, how you train and how you develop someone to move up the ladder. And then the last guiding principle is that asks become bigger over time as relationships strengthen. You don't ask someone who you've just met to do something that you'd ask someone that you've had relationships with for years. So one thing that we like to think about when we're talking about ladder of engagement are the asks that we make at each level of the ladder, so at each level of the relationship, and making stronger asks as the relationship becomes stronger. So those are a few of the guiding principles. So let's look at an actual volunteer ladder of engagement. And so a person may come into your organization as an ally or a supporter. And you will think about, really, how are you going to move that person from an ally to a volunteer leader? Everyone won't move from an ally to a volunteer leader, but it's important to think about the steps to move that relationship. So the next level that you'd probably move an ally to is a volunteer. Since they've shown interest in your work, they can actually go out and help do that work. So they move to a volunteer. They may come out to one volunteer activity. The next level to engage them or move them to would be an active volunteer, someone who maybe attends 2 or 3 volunteer activities, right? And if they accomplish that, if they show commitment to that, then you can consider them a leadership prospect. And one thing we talk about with leadership, you have to prepare someone for leadership. You have to train them for leadership. And one of the things that we like to do is to test people to be leaders. We usually do 2 tests, and a test really is giving a leader an opportunity to do something, or prospective leader the opportunity to do something that they would do as a leader. So if they are recruiting volunteers as a leader, if they are setting up or tabling for an event or making a presentation, that's something that you would have them do as a test. But you don't just throw them into it. That's something that you prepare them and you train them to do. So once they've done those tests and once you've prepared them and you train them, they become a volunteer leader and they start taking on some of that work that helps to advance your goals and advance your mission. So that's a small example of a volunteer ladder of engagement. Ladder of engagements look different. depending on your work and depending on your goal and what you're trying to do. So we're going to get a little bit more into that. So there are some tips and tricks for developing your ladder of engagement. And the first one is to define by role and by audience. So when you think about the roles that you're going to have in your ladder engagement, you have to think about the ones that are most fitting to your organization and to what you're trying to accomplish. You want to start with low bar ask. So when you think about what you want people to do, what they should do is in aligned with their experience and aligned with where they are in relation to you or relationship with you. We can use the example of dating or marriage, for example. What you would not ask someone that you just met or who you're just interested in to marry you. You make other asks first. It may be asking a person out on a date. It may be dating that person. It might be asking to be in a formal relationship. Following that, it might be asking them to marry you, to be engaged. So there are steps that you take, and you make low bar ask, and you make increasingly higher asks as a relationship develops. And then one thing that we like to talk about with ladders of engagement that's really important, especially with the phase we are in with technology and work, is just integrating online and offline asks. So for many of you, for many of your organizations, the first place that someone may engage with you might be online, right? They might like a tweet or they might like a post. That can be the first ladder of your engagement, how you want to engage someone online. So that's an example of how you develop ladders of engagement. So we're going to dive a little bit more into this and go into case studies so you all can see real life examples of how we apply the Snowflake model and the ladder of engagement. So on the last webinar, for those of you who joined us, we talked a lot about developing your strategic framework. And your strategic framework is your mission, your goal, your strategy, and your tactics. So we're going to look at the Obama campaign, the 2012 election. We're going to look at their strategic framework and how we use this to develop the Snowflake and the ladder of engagement. So the first thing for the Obama campaign, our mission, the goal, the ultimate thing that we wanted to accomplish, the ultimate change that we wanted to see in the world was to re-elect President Obama, right? And then we knew that we would meet our mission if we accomplished the goal of winning 270 electoral votes, because that's how many electoral votes you need to win the presidency in the United States. Then our strategy was to register, persuade, and turn out voters by building a grassroots team that would help us to execute that. And then our tactics, so the ways that we were going to use our resources to meet our strategy, to accomplish our registering and persuading and turning out voters, was to use grassroots outreach. So we talked a little bit about grassroots outreach earlier, but phone banking, canvassing, talking to voters through digital communications, finance, and constituency outreach. Those are the ways that we accomplished our goal of winning 270 electoral votes and re-electing President Obama to the presidency. So we're going to talk about how this looked for a Snowflake model. We talk about how your Snowflake model, the roles within your model, are going to depend really on your strategy and your tactics. So if our strategy was to register, persuade, and turn out voters, we needed roles that were going to connect with that strategy. So this, again, is the Snowflake model. And for the campaign, at the center, we had our organizer, right? The person who was working in the community and working to find our leaders. So outside of the organizer, you had your neighborhood team leaders. And neighborhood team leaders basically were there to help recruit and find people in the community who would help us to do outreach, specifically doing that voter registration, doing the phone banking, doing the canvassing. So the neighborhood team leader then helped us find the canvas captain, the phone bank captain, the volunteer recruitment, the voter registration captain. And those are the three smaller circles that you would see outside of the dark blue circle. So that's how our Snowflake developed, and that's how we knew the roles that we needed within the Snowflake So those captains or core team members, we can use both words to describe them, found volunteers that would help them to do the phone banking, do the canvassing, and do the voter registration. So that's the Snowflake model for the Obama campaign. Let's look at the ladder of engagement. So for the ladder of engagement, at the very basic level, at the lowest level, we wanted people to be supporters. So we engaged supporters at rallies, they came to the offices, they signed up, they pledged their support behind President Obama. Some of them did this online. We talked about online to offline integration and using both in our ladder. So we started with supporter, and once a person became a supporter, we asked them to become a volunteer because that was the step that made the most sense, right? That wasn't too big of an ask, but helped us to meet our goals. And once a person became a volunteer, the more they showed up and the more they engaged, they became an active volunteer. And from there, let's say they were really interested in one area. Let's say they consistently came out to phone banking. We decided to make them a core team member, or we're using other terms to describe them, but we asked them to be a captain. We tested them and prepared them to be a captain. So that person can move from an active volunteer to a phone bank captain. And then from there, prepared and trained them to be the neighborhood team leader. The neighborhood team leader was the highest step on our ladder. And we often try to move people from supporter to neighborhood team leader. Not everybody went all the way up the ladder. Some people stayed and just became volunteers. Some became active volunteers. But using the structure and having clear roles helped us to meet our goal. We have another case study and another example. I'm using Alumni Network, and Kristen can talk a little bit more about this.
Thanks. Yeah, so we worked with an alumni association for one of the bigger alumni networks, university networks in the U.S. And when they came into us, they asked us, they really wanted to be able to have this kind of mission level, developing a stronger alumni network, right? And that was their big goal overall, is really thinking about what does that mean? How do we improve the ability to communicate with our members, and then also, you have so many people graduating from this university, but aren't necessarily engaged with their network yet. So we really kind of helped them define from that beginning level of their strategic framework, right? Thinking about their mission from developing a stronger alumni network, but then really also setting a SMART goal for that. So in previous webinars, we've talked a little bit about what does a SMART goal mean, and really making sure that we're being specific in our asks and that they're measurable. And so we talked about doubling the size of paying members, so dues paying members in the alumni network, over the course of 5 years to go from 96,000 members to 180,000 members. Our strategy around this we wanted to make this happen was peer-to-peer outreach. So we were going to be counting on individuals within our network who are already there. As a college graduate, you probably hang out with a lot of people or know other people who are also from your college, and you kind of continue to build that network. So we were going to count on them for that peer-to-peer piece. And then on the tactics, we really thought through, how are we going to incentivize and really make that peer-to-peer outreach happen. So thinking about phone banks, thinking about house parties, and all of these different tactics. So for us, it was, I think, a lot of advocacy spaces I'm in or other settings think, well, sometimes this approach can work for a political campaign really easily, but how does this work on issue work? And look, I'm just seeing that from Tina as well. How does this work on an issue rather than a political campaign? So perfect, Tina. This is a chance that we had really to explore thinking about our specific goals and applying that peer-to-peer effort and that kind of growth within a volunteer base and structure within a volunteer base to a non-political space as well. Natalie, can you get the next slide? There we go. Thank you. So when we started to think about how we wanted to build out our teams within these alumni groups, right now, most of these alumni they had chapters in their own community, but the chapters were pretty large and didn't really have structure. They were existing, but mostly for kind of social aspect and not necessarily about growth or making sure that they were providing networking community to maybe new graduates and things like that. So we really wanted to think about how do we apply an organizing model in this situation so that we can continue to engage all these new individuals coming in who have this shared interest together, and who do care ultimately about their university, right? So we really went through and thought through our Snowflake level. So we have a membership lead. So that was someone who was kind of outside of the chapter network. I think each chapter they had already in existence had presidents, but they were was more titular than most, right? Like it was not always an active role. So we really wanted to define an active role for this growth, right? So we had a membership lead. Underneath that, we had captains. So they had 6 captains, I think, depending on their city sizes, right? So if it was a smaller region they're working in, it might be like 4 membership captains. But so those are people who kind of then worked directly with what we called ambassadors. And each membership captain had about 10 ambassadors, between 6 and 10 ambassadors. And these were your actual peer-to-peer people, right? So for example, I live in Washington, D.C. We might have had kind of split the city up into 4, and then it had in a couple of suburbs. So in DC, for example, you would have had a captain in the, you can divide it up kind of by region, or you can just divide it up by your own network. And then the ambassador within that, they would have a list of 100 alumni in their area that we knew about. So we really did a Snowflake model for us was this program was based on geography, but we've also seen these based more on constituency. That can often work in issue tape work where we're thinking about organizing different groups. So we've done it before where it's people who care about seniors and people who want to take on the parenting role and kind of divvying things up that way. But for us, it was done by geographic area. So we had each ambassador had a list of 100 people. So as Natalie had kind of showed you in that previous slide where we started to see that scale, when you think about each ambassador, if there's 10 under each captain, being able to reach out to 100 potential new members, potential alumni, that was a big stretch for us. So we would go through and start phone banking and really start to connect with these individuals. And like Natalie talked about with the ladder of engagement, it wasn't just a straight ask to become a member. We really did want to do relationship building. So if we look, I think the next slide is our ladder of engagement. We recognize that we wanted to kind of build them up that ladder, but that they have already received a lot of calls, kind of the direct dialer calls where they get the call to be a member, and it's an easy no, I think, in that case, because it's not someone you have a relationship with. And because you're not tied to the organization. So we really started with that base of 100 alumni for each ambassador. And the goal there was just to have a conversation with the ambassador. And then for the ambassador to make their big ask after, getting them to chat for 10 to 15 minutes and explaining kind of why they were involved in the alumni network. They asked them to come out to an event. And so those events really could range from things like a house party, in their own area, right? So they could come and get to meet some other alumni. It could be it's a college, so they have a big sports fan base. So sometimes they would ask them to come out to watch parties for whatever football or basketball game was on, or it could even just be like a social or a happy hour right in their own neighborhood. So really just making that low bar ask of getting someone to be an event attendee. And when that person came out, we knew it was they were showing their level to engage and their level to actually kind of come from that list level to actually showing up in person. So at these events, we would talk to them and kind of get them to be involved and make continuous asks for them to participate, and start to learn what being a member again meant so that we could ask them for the next level eventually for becoming a member. So I think it was after about 2 or 3 events they attended and participated in, we would get them to be a member and making that ask so that we could start to help reach our initial goal of reaching the 180,000. And it didn't stop for us there either. We wanted to continue this growth and really thinking about scaling the program. So we would go from member to then asking them eventually to become an ambassador, like those people who had reached out to them, so that we can continue to connect with even more alumni across each region, and then also be able to be captains. We knew that this was going to be a long-term program. This didn't end with an election date. This was going to be something that they wanted to continue running for years, and really be able to build that. So we knew we needed to develop people in the pipeline as well to take on those roles of ambassadors, to take on those roles of captains, and also eventually membership lead, so that as somebody maybe moved or as somebody's life changed and they didn't have the ability to continue on in that role, we would have built up a pipeline of people who were engaged in their alumni association and were ready to kind of step into those new roles. See a question from David. Oh, there we go. So David was just asking if people stay in place after we reach our goals, and assuming that that continues, and how does it maintain itself? So great. Like we said, I think it is really dependent upon your goals. For a political campaign, we all know that that you are usually working towards an end date, right? So kind of creating that structure and getting us to that place where we can hit the election day, and then hopefully structures continue on for community support, but it doesn't have to be as solid and in place as it was. For this alumni association, even when they hit 180,000, they're going to reassess that and continue to think about what does that mean to keep people engaged, because it's a constant renewal process. And so we've seen that a lot with a lot of the issue advocacy I've done as well. You really want to make sure that it's a sustainable program. So thinking through, it might be kind of less activity drive, right? Instead of maybe doing weekly events, you're doing monthly or bi-monthly events to keep people engaged and involved, so that you're ready to either continue your growth like we were with the Alumni Association, or in my advocacy space, sometimes it's you don't know what fights are going to be coming up in your future, but you want to have an engaged base at all times, just depending on what might pop up, and being ready for the next fight.
Excellent. Thanks, Kristen. I know we've been talking for a while and haven't had a space to answer questions, so we want to take this moment before we hop into the workshop, because you all are actually going to get to develop your own Snowflake models. But before we jump into that, we want to just give a few minutes if you all have any questions to answer. And of course, you can type it in the chat box. We also love to hear your voices, so if you want to ask your question, feel free to raise your hand under the attendee section, and we will unmute you if you would like to ask your question, but feel free to chat it if that's your preference as well. So I see one hand raised, and it's Janet. Janet, I'm going to unmute you if you have a question. Janet, are you on? Do you have a question? And I understand that folks may have raised their hand earlier in the conversation, not intending to say anything, but to test it out. Okay, so it looks like we have a comment from Pia. She says, hi, my concern is around how to get from supporter to volunteer. So many supporters, but people are very busy between work commitments and family. It's very hard to find the time to volunteer. That's a great comment. And that's something that, we as organizers, we often see and we often experience. And a lot of teams that we work with also often share that concern. So we often talk about in our organizing meeting people where they are, seeing what they need in order to volunteer. So making it easy for them is what we try to do. So oftentimes, let's say your volunteers are parents, maybe providing childcare at the place where you want them to volunteer or for their task to make it easier for them. Trying to meet your volunteers or your supporters where they're at. We often talk about finding the right activity for them and right role for them. In our training, we often talk about the 3 kind of no's, right? we hear the no, not that, no, not ever, and no, not that time, right? So you have to identify the right no for the person. So if you're talking with a supporter and you want them to volunteer, they may say no, but you have to talk with them and find out, is it a no because they don't want to do the activity that you're asking them to do? They may not be comfortable talking, you know, to a person face to face, may prefer talking with them over the phone, or they prefer to table or do something else. It can be, no, like this time won't work. This month is really busy for me, but call me back next month and I'd be willing to volunteer. And then you, of course, have your people who are no, not ever, I don't want to volunteer. And that's unfortunate. And, you know, you have people that you will lose. But really, I'd say it's, you know, meeting your volunteers, meeting your supporters where they are, finding ways to engage them and making it easier for them to volunteer. And the second thing is identify, you know, why they may not want to volunteer. Kristen, is there anything that I'm missing? Anything that you'd add to that?
No, I think that's great. I also think that, and this is kind of getting to Janet's question. I see, Janet, that you got disconnected and trying to use the mic, but a big part of doing that kind of supporter to volunteer piece is the relationship building, right? So we know that we can kind of build them up in a lot of ways, and kind of get them engaged by taking more digital actions and starting to let them know who we are, but also making sure that we are really establishing relationships with them. It is so much harder to say no to somebody when you care about that individual as well, right? And so thinking about, you know, when I've done political politics, you know, we always say that the person came in for the candidate, the volunteer came in for the candidate, but they stay for the organizing team, right? That's the people who keep them coming back in the end. And the same applies for issue advocacy, right? They come in because they're passionate and they're a supporter on something. But the more that we build a relationship and the more that we can show the urgency for their work, and their need to support it at a higher level, it makes it, people keep coming back, right? Volunteers we know want to see that they're being helpful, and when we create a space for that, when we show that their work is actually helping us be productive, that they're a big part of the fight, that we're thankful and appreciative for that, and that we really value their work, we'll see them kind of keep coming back. But that doesn't mean that we won't get rejection on some of our outreach. So Janet, I understand that. I think, you know, when we talk about, for example, in the Alumni Association group, right, we had a list of 100 people for each ambassador to call, but we never really thought that each 100 of those were going to become members, right? We were trying to get a small portion of that. And so also kind of not only setting our own expectations, but setting expectations for our volunteers who might be helping with this process, that the big step is reaching out, and the understanding that not everyone's going to get involved, and that not everyone's time is now to get involved. Like Natalie said, it might be not this time for them, but don't give up, because they might come back to us in the end, right, when they see a lot more engagement. I think that's something that we're seeing a lot of right now in the US, right? People who maybe weren't engaged in the past year, but are feeling the urgency of now and want to get involved, and you know, they're ready to be out there. So you know, kind of showing patience and recognizing that everyone's going to come in their own time, and when they're ready for that fight, is good, and just keep that touch going with them. Just make sure that you kind of, it doesn't mean you have to ask them every week, but still keep them in the loop.
Excellent. And I'm loving seeing you all respond to each other in this chat. Tina offered really good advice on holding fun events, engages supporters, and helps ensure they will come back for more. So, you know, connecting to what Kristen said about really thanking volunteers and valuing them, making them feel a part of something bigger. So thank you for that, Tina. Janet had another question. She said, how do we deal with resentment from those who are volunteering against those who don't? And I'm not sure, Janet, if you mean with like how you treat people within your volunteer team, and favoritism. And with that, it's just, you know, valuing each member of your team, making sure that they're doing work that they enjoy. You know, we are always looking for opportunities to empower people and to push people into leadership, right? But we don't want to overlook people who can be leaders, but on the surface, we don't necessarily think of them as leaders. That's why we talk a lot about training and talk a lot about testing to prepare people. So looking at everyone as a potential leader and trying to prepare them and trying to move them up the ladder. And then Janet has a comment. We get 220 members at a dinner, but only 20 at a membership meeting. Got it. So people like to come out for the things that are fun, but don't always want to do the work. And I think part of that is trying to make everything fun, and also for those who show up for the more engaging, like maybe treating it as an opportunity to reward people who are doing good work. So if you have people coming out to the membership meetings or the things that may be considered less fun, awarding them with funner activities. That's kind of a way to navigate that. We have another question from Catherine. Her question is, if a campaign is trying to fight inequality and you want your campaign to have multiple layers, an example is the Fight for 15 as it tackles racism, sexism, and inequality, what are some tips for simplifying messaging while ensuring the message is multifaceted? That is a great question. Kristen, do you have any thoughts on this? I can jump in as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think this comes back to us on kind of personal story and what brings people into the process, right? So some people are going to join, you know, in the Fight for 15. Natalie and I have been working with a group of organizers working on that as well in the US, and different things bring each individual in. And you see this a lot in issue advocacy where, you know, we might have 25 policy points that we want to talk about, but getting someone to talk about their own personal story, what impacts them, why they're out, why these issues are important for them, is really moving. And the same goes with our messaging when we're talking about it in, you know, kind of in our communications, if we're thinking about emails, thinking about sharing those stories, kind of having people discuss what's important to them and why they're involved in the fight. Because it is a lot to digest, and you know, we can, you know, when we're starting to talk about sexism, racism, that is years, centuries of things that we could really start to break down and have a lot of intellectual debate about. But kind of reminding people what brought them in and their own personal piece, I think, is a good way to help start giving people messaging to connect to.
Awesome. Great question, Catherine. Great answer, Kristen. Awesome. So at this point, I think we're going to move on to actually workshopping this and applying these structures to your work and to your campaigns. So we're going to each think through our Snowflake model. We're not going to develop our ladder today, but you're going to do that, and you'll see in the control panel. If you go to materials, you'll see the worksheet that we're using for this and some guiding principles. You want to remember that your strategy is really going to dictate your structure, right? So you saw that in the case studies and how we use the strategy. If we use the OFA example, we knew that we were trying to build a volunteer structure that would do outreach to voters. That was our strategy to getting to our goal of 270 electoral votes. Once you know your strategy and your tactics, you can use that to develop your team structure. So I want you all to think about what it is that you all are trying to accomplish and your approach to accomplishing it, and then think about what roles fit into that. And I just lost the slide, but it says the key is to develop a snowflake and ladders of engagement that facilitate sustained action over time. So thinking of how you're going to use this to just sustain your action, to keep going, to keep building. And we'll use an example here. We have, if one of your main tactics is canvassing, how does that influence your snowflake or ladder of engagement, right? So in your snowflake, do you want to have a core team member or that's a canvas captain? Do you want to have specific roles for volunteers to canvas? So thinking about how those things connect. So you all are going to have 10 minutes. And I'll play some light jazz music to distract us in this time. But you're going to have 10 minutes to draw a draft of your snowflake. using your worksheet. So on your worksheet, you'll see you'll have multiple pages. On the first page is really an explanation of the activity. And then on the second page, you'll see a blank snowflake where you can actually draw in and start to write in your roles. And with this, you're really going to think about what are the programs that you're running, what roles and responsibilities can you delegate to your volunteers to help build and scale your campaign, and that will help you to execute your strategy. So I'll leave these two questions and two guideposts on the screen as you all begin to create your own snowflakes. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to chat them in the chat box, and we'll join back together in 10 minutes. Okay, everyone should be wrapping up their Snowflake models, and we'll come back together in about a minute. All right, everyone should be coming back now, and everyone should have a draft of their Snowflake model. So we're going to go ahead and just do a really quick debrief. Would love to hear back from you all. How was that activity? If you developed your Snowflake, if you have all of your roles, like why don't you share with us some of your roles? And I know folks might be typing. But hopefully you will use this time to really think through, what are the roles that you need in order to achieve your goal or to execute your strategy. Thinking about how those roles fit, thinking about making the right ask for your ladder of engagement. We didn't develop our ladder of engagement, but that will be our next step, thinking about how we're going to engage people at each level. We have Tina. Grant works to get drug prices reduced for African AIDS sufferers. And I'm guessing that GRAN might be, or GRAN might be your structure or the group that you're working within. Would love to hear some of the roles that you have, if you have any. And it stands for the Grandmothers Advocacy Network. Excellent. So Tina will be mobilizing and organizing grandmothers, I think, within her structure. Excellent. And I understand that folks might still be developing their Snowflake models or might be shy about sharing it. So I would love to open the floor for other questions or other comments before we wrap up this webinar. I see that Mike has a campaign for Put Food in the Budget. They have a campaign organizer, a communications team, people that table, join rallies, create flyers. Excellent. I love it. That's really great, Mike. And I think with this, and I don't know how you built out your Snowflake because I can't see it obviously, but thinking about, like, I love that you have a communications team, for example, and thinking about all the roles that would be within that. So if you have, for each of these positions, I think it would be great if you had like a lead. So I know you have your campaign organizer who's probably at the center, you have your communications team, I don't know what you'll call your tabling team, but maybe they'll be your events. And then from there, you have people who will fit the role of tabling, joining rallies, creating flyers. But that's an excellent idea, and those are really great roles for what you're doing. And they do committee meetings and meetings with allies. Well, 40 communities provincially that they engage. Excellent, Mike. And then Tina came back with what her grandmother's advocacy network is doing. They're outreaching to pharmaceutical industry. They're reaching out to politicians, to media, and website, and a petition designed to mobilize supporters. Great. It's excellent to see some of these tactics. So it'll be really awesome now that you all know your strategy, know your tactics, and what you all are trying to accomplish, like how that will fit within your roles. And if we don't have any questions, let's talk about next steps. So our next steps really are to just outlining clear roles and responsibilities for your volunteer leaders and teams. And we have some folks who've already done that. Tina and Mike, thank you so much both for sharing. And then your next step following that will be to flesh out your ladder of engagement. And then, as always, if you all have questions while you're developing these, and if you need other examples or just someone to look it over, you can feel free to reach out to me or to Kristen. My email is encode@270strategies.com. Kristen is kpurdy@270strategies.com. And it has been a pleasure to work with you all on this webinar. Again, this is the second of 3. We have our last webinar in December, and we would love for you all to join us for that. We're going to talk even more about volunteer recruitment and volunteer engagement. We got a lot of questions about that today, so we'd be happy to talk more about that on that webinar. And last but not least, we have a survey. Your feedback means so much to us, so we'd love for you to complete this quick survey and just let us know how you felt about this webinar. What were some of the key takeaways? What would be helpful in the future? So again, thank you all so much for your participation today, and we look forward to talking with you all hopefully on the next webinar. Thanks again to the Broadband Institute, to Alejandra and her team, and until next time, have a good evening, good afternoon. Bye.